Hello everyone, my name is Greg Masters and I'm the managing editor of SC Magazine, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the next webcast in our e-conference on PCI 3.0, moving from an audit scramble to a state of continuous compliance. This session is sponsored by LogRhythm. For organizations partnering with the payment card brands, upcoming changes in the PCI standards increase focus on continual compliance and regular testing of controls. With headlines every week announcing breaches, many of the personnel charged with demonstrating compliance for their firms are understandably anxious about how to prepare for more rigorous audits. But tools and strategies are available to assist. In this webcast, guidance will be provided on how companies can establish a state of continuous compliance without adding staff, and what they should be doing now to prepare for an investigation in the event of a compromise. We have three speakers for this session. Seth Goldhammer is director of LogRhythm's product group. He has more than 15 years of experience working in the network management and security industry, including stints at Roving Planet, which he founded, and at Tipping Point, 3Com, and HP Networking. Ken Stasiak is CEO and founder of Secure State, an information security consulting firm, which he founded in 2001. Prior, he was at Ernst & Young. John Melvin is Incident Response Technical Lead at Secure State. He has more than 10 years of experience as a senior analyst and project manager in a number of security fields. Prior, he was the lead incident responder for the U.S. Air Force. We're going to kick things off with Ken. Welcome, Ken.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks everyone for attending this afternoon. Before we begin, I just want to let everybody know that Secure State's been doing QSA work for over 7 years. So a lot of information that we're going to supply has been over quite some period of time, pulling the trends together in what we've seen in the PCI arena. We're also an ASB, a PA QSA for the payment applications, and also a PFI for the forensics investigation arm of the payment brands. So let's talk a little bit about the industry as a whole. And looking at about 3 to 4 years ago, the adoption rate of PCI was really in the infancy stages. We did a lot of gap analysis, a lot of organizations trying to figure out what did PCI mean, how do they get compliant, and in many instances, what does it all mean? And we're starting to see the adoption rate of PCI is definitely reaching maturity. More organizations are PCI compliant. We've seen our services from gap analysis turn more into a report on compliance and helping organizations every year annually go through the audit to show or to demonstrate compliance. We've also seen the payment brands also follow this shift, where they originally were looking at level 1s and putting out notices that everyone that the level 1 providers need to be compliant. They've followed that up shortly then with level 2s, and over the last several years have been looking at level 3s and 4s to get them compliant. And then you also see the PCI Council and the brands focusing more on the controls. And we've seen individual SIGs, special interest groups, come out and look at additional guidance on the controls. Specifically, last year you've seen that the SIG came out for the PCI risk assessment. And obviously it's been a requirement. It's been in the PCI DSS for quite some time. And with the SIG, they're focusing more on each individual control and providing more guidance around the PCI risk, VM environments, virtual machine environments, et cetera. So we're starting to see from where we were 4 years ago to today a lot of a different shift in the mentality of PCI as a whole. So brings us to kind of current day of 2013 and 2014 and beyond. So the PCI Council has recently released the PCI DSS 3.0. And as a QSA organization, we're getting much more rigorous control and testing procedures being pronounced by the Council. And what does that mean? It means that we have to look at not only are the controls compliant with the checkbox, but we're actually looking at now what are the effectiveness of the controls. Are they in place for the entire year of compliance as it should be? And we're starting to see the mentality shift of being compliant as a point in time to really proof of compliance throughout the year. And you'll see that as the trend kind of comes through that, traditional assessments that have been part of the PCI standard also need to be increased and matured. And one of these areas is specifically everyone does pen testing. And if you looked at it and you've been compliant for the last 4 or 5 years, you're going to see the value of your penetration testing go down year after year. And with that, with the effectiveness in the PCI console, they want to see more increasing around the penetration testing themselves. And so how do you do that with a pretty standard service that's been offered is we're starting to see organizations incorporate, and what we've done is put incident response testing with the penetration test. So when you go through and you perform your penetration test, we're seeing that how does an organization respond to the penetration test? What are they seeing from a logging perspective? What is their MSSP picking up? And how all this is being correlated based on the penetration test. And that's really where the council, that's really where as QSAs, we're going to start looking at. So when we start looking through for report of compliance, the penetration test results, we're going to start looking at how did the organization respond to that penetration test with their incident response program, the logs, the monitoring, etc. So this is kind of the money slide, if you will. What we're finding is since the controls for PCI, when you were first looking through to become compliant, obviously there's a large cost associated with being compliant and going through the controls. And we're finding at over a period of time, the effectiveness of just doing the control testing is gone down. And so has the spending for PCI. Many years we get calls and say, you did the report on compliance last year, or you filled out the SAQ for us, services should go down. And that's true if the PCI standard stayed pretty much intact. But however, every year they provide more guidance, and we're seeing that the guidance is shifting now to effectiveness of controls. And with that, there's going to be and need to be an increase in budget. And one of the things that we put this in there, especially when we talk to the executive management and C-level, is they don't understand that. They don't understand why we're compliant last year, we're compliant the year before. Why would we have to increase our costs in 2014, 15, and 16 to become compliant since we've already been compliant? And really, this slide here is demonstrating the fact that there's going to be an increase in cost of either product, personnel, or assessment fees in order to start to really effectively have these controls implemented at organizations. So as you're looking at your budgets for 2014, this is a great time to bring this slide up to executive management and let them know that they're going to be increased costs over year for PCI to really stay compliant and not just be compliant. So areas of focus, now clearly, there's 220-some controls in PCI, but what we're finding is there's a huge breakdown in the log, in the reviewing of the logs, the correlation of events, and really setting up the event triggers. And there's a lot of reasons why. Clearly when you went through, we go on site, we're finding that organizations that have been compliant want to issue a ROC, report on compliance. They bring us in, they say, okay, 45 days is our lead times. Once you come on site, we got 45 days. We're finding there's a little bit of a scramble, if you will, of getting things in order. And some of those are pulling the logs, pulling other activities, correlating events, and giving them to the auditor so that when we go through the attestation for the report on compliance, we can say, yes, everything conforms to. But that scramble, as we've seen it over the last 3 years, is really going to start to affect 2014 compliance. So when we come on site, when the auditors come on site, your QSA, to actually review where your compliance is at, that 45-day scramble is going to be cut down considerably. Auditors are going to be looking for on-site, not having that time frame, and really putting the scrutiny to, can you provide it now, not 45 days later, and still be compliant. In that same regard, for organizations that have matured and believe that they're in pretty good compliance state, one of the things that we've been doing recently is these PFI tabletop exercises, and this kind of goes hand in hand in a couple positions. If you're having a hard time getting additional budget to show the fact that you need more funding for the effectiveness of the controls, or you feel, and executive management feels that they have PCI pretty well under wraps, the PFI tabletop exercise is really to simulate what would happen if a breach occurred at the organization. And clearly, if a breach happens, the executive manager is going to say, I thought we were compliant. What happened? And it puts a big strain, crisis management, on the organization as a whole. This tabletop is then in a safe environment where you can come in, grab one of the PFI organizations, and have them go through a mock simulation of what would happen. When they come on site, what do they look for? What is the information that's readily available? And as you'll see, many times a lot of organizations have outsourced some of this critical function to MSSPs, and you'll find that there's a pretty good breakdown, especially if you say, let's go back 3 months and we need the logs and we need to correlate the external monitoring from the internal and correlate the events for a PFI investigation. So we found that through this exercise, a number of different organizations that thought they were pretty mature showed pretty good signs of weakness in being able to respond to a PFI investigation. John, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, this is John Melton. So just kind of recap that last bullet, in my opinion, the biggest thing is show maturity as an organization. So it's no longer acceptable to just have security devices in place, specifically like a SIEM, and an IR plan in place. The QSAs and PFI companies are going to start requiring proof that these are functioning and integrated and tested. So we remember, a few years back, just having these components in place was probably enough to pass that assessment. But as we've seen the breach reports that have come out, it's just simply not enough to have these devices in place. We need to make sure we test the effectiveness of it. So looking at logs is a key point. So the SIEM is doing a great job collecting anything and everything we could possibly think of, but if you're not looking at it, there's no effectiveness of that. So our key point, look at the logs because the payment card brands are. So they know when a breach is happening before you do because they're diligent in looking at those trends and correlations. So I think that kind of recaps that bullet. So.
Good. So John brings up a point. How do the payment card brands know you've been compromised before you do? And in many instances, we get on the call with organizations and they receive the letter and said, we believe that you've been breached. And in many instances, it's 60, could be 100 credit cards that they believe had fraudulent charges. So it's not this huge population that you see in the news. When they're looking through it, they're triangulating the credit card fraud back to an organization. If they have 14 locations and 50% of those have shown fraudulent charges, they believe there's enough there to warrant an investigation. And so this letter comes and they say, we believe you've been breached and you need to contact the PFI. And one of the things that we've gone through and talked to organizations with is, well, how did you not know? And part of that whole process is what we kind of outlined on this slide is really when organizations go through, about only 10% detect our attacks or attacks that have been done with the organization through penetration tests. And of those, how many have looked at the incident response process and the logs and correlated them back and said, we saw the attack, we were able to respond to the attack, and then there invoke the incident response program. So that's a pretty alarming statistics, knowing that everyone's doing penetration tests, but not correlating them back. We're also seeing that over 90% of the incidents that we investigate have been going on for quite some time, in many instances months. So when you look at the logs, the correlation back, can you show proof that you've been able to log not only from your internal systems, but also any service provider that's providing monitoring on the external or other devices within the environment? And we find that there's a major breakdown when we start going back in time and trying to retrace how an event occurred. And And John's been, as noted, been doing investigations quite some time, and he came up with an algorithm that calculates basically if you have over 3,000 endpoints in your environment, you've already been compromised, which is a pretty staggering, I guess, statistic, as well as when you look at it from a complexity standpoint, what does that mean? How do you know or not know in this instance that you've had a breach? It could be, very simple malware that's put out there that's laying dormant, or it could be a pretty ongoing breach that hasn't been picked up by the logs or your environment.
Right. That last bullet, this is John again, that last bullet is really, think about it in terms of 3,000 endpoints, all the devices and systems you have in place, and all of the user accounts you have in place, and all the applications that are externally facing and remote methods that you can get into your environment. Typically, when we see large environments with the 3,000 endpoint threshold, somebody has already infiltrated inside the network, more than likely using valid credentials that are part of your resources and people in your environment. They're using your own tools, applications, and remote methods against you with your own valid accounts. So therefore, even though a SIEM device could be logging all of these user artifacts for logins and resource access and moving about the network, because it's a valid user, it really makes it difficult for an organization to determine a valid user credentials being used by an unauthorized party. So it really puts a lot of emphasis on an organization to baseline and know your environment and be diligent with looking at those logs to find anything fishy or out of the ordinary from normal day-to-day business. But after 3+ months, a persistent threat attacker that already has valid credentials might blend in seamlessly into the environment with what would be perceived as normal. So it really goes back to having that baseline to begin with, having that diligence to look at logs right off the bat, and then testing the effectiveness of everything in place, whether it's a SIEM or an MSSP that provides that capability.
And so the last point here is, when we come in and do the investigation, specifically for a breach of cardholder information, you've already pretty much been guilty until proven innocent. In a lot of instances, organizations feel like we have to find something when we do the investigation. And unfortunately, all we have to do is really find controls that are not effective. And once we find controls that are not effective, and we find enough information to paint the picture on which the cardholders believe information has been taken or compromised, at that point, that preliminary report goes back to the brands, and that then further more investigation on why did you say you were compliant, but when the PFI investigators came in, found laxes in the controls, specifically the effectiveness of the controls. And so we say when you're going through that simulation of PFI, they bring in a whole different insight that maybe your QSA hadn't thought of before, and much more rigorous testing around that in order to respond to a PFI investigation. So at this point, we're going to turn it over to Seth, who's going to go through a number of different ways that automation and technology is advanced to really help with a lot of the stuff that we've identified in the first few slides.
Great. Thank you, Ken and John, and thanks to everyone for joining today's webinar. John and Ken talked about the importance of log management and SIEM technology and the need to really show the real use of this technology in your environment in regards to your PCI compliance efforts. Today, I'm going to be covering how a new generation of SIEM is really being used to help automate your organization's security and audit processes for meeting your PCI DSS compliance requirements, and to do that with reduced efforts. So first, how does a SIEM provide support for PCI compliance? Well, first and foremost, SIEMs provide a centralized security information management by collecting, correlating, retaining, and analyzing all the security information from all of your different data sources, applications, hosts, network devices, physical devices, and your security devices on your network. Secondly, SIEMs are going to provide an automated, continuous monitoring of that security information through different types of behavioral rules and statistical analysis rules, as well as correlation rules that we'll talk about. And third, as a result of that, SIMs are providing a situational awareness via this correlation of events, looking across different disparate systems for that correlation across your organizational infrastructure. So really, next-generation SIMs are not only able to allow you to report on compliance demonstration, but they're providing an ongoing assurance of compliance. That automated assurance reduces your compliance burden by offloading the work of interpreting weekly and monthly reports with real-time alerts and alarms when there are indications that you may be moving out of a specific control. So SIM really caters to specific different roles and functions that are involved with compliance. The major roles and functions involved in PCI compliance are certainly at the audit level. There's executive management who needs to be involved, IT operations, security operations, and security management. To provide customers with a comfort and a demonstration of compliance, LogRhythm provides a knowledge-based module that really contains the different elements that are involved in providing compliance across these different roles. We're going to speak to that. The knowledge-based modules really contain a collection of different artifacts, whether there are reports or report packages, whether there are dashboards, so how we can look at information in real time, alarms, so how we can get notifications in real time, as well as rules that correlate information or look at behavior of information to recognize that controls may be moving out of compliance as that occurs. So we're going to talk to these specific roles and the type of information that really becomes that is of most concern to each of them. So let's first talk about the audit use case. The audit role is performed by the external QSA and can use evidence from the SIM to verify that the organization is compliant with PCI requirements. The QSA is verifying the organization's compliance by testing and reviewing evidence of the effectiveness of these security controls with the security operations' ability to handle the security incidents and the security management's oversight of these security operations. SIMs can support this audit role by automating the process of collecting and storing that compliance evidence. This evidence at a minimum should include details related to access control, change management, malware prevention, patch management, and security incident response. So SIM provides evidence for specific PCI DSS controls showing specific control support, including control and type of support, whether direct support or augmenting the compliance support process. For example, reports around change management evidence, including configuration and policy changes, malware prevention evidence, including infections, scans, success and failed signature updates. Report of audit evidence for access control include access granted and revoked, the access failure and success, authentication success and failure, and account management. So that's creation, deletion, and modification of accounts, and certainly a focus on privileged access accounts. And patch management evidence, including success and failed signature updates. Now, talking about the executive management, this is obviously a higher level than where the QSA is performing. The executive management role is used really to provide the oversight of the effectiveness of the audit and operations and the different security roles. And so this is primarily going to be through reports and dashboards on an executive summary level. So these summary reports of audit, operations, and security events to support that executive management oversight and demonstrate that oversight. So now let's talk about specific security operations use cases. The security operations role uses security events from the SIM to provide real-time security incident management and response. So the technology is responsible for identifying the security events from analysis of collected logs and advanced correlation of those logs across the organization and through behavioral analysis of those activities that are represented by that log detail. For example, correlation rules can recognize a denial of service attack from an external host directly followed by a critical error or a shutdown condition on an impacted internal host, so on that same host. This rule would identify the success of an external denial of service attack to cause a loss of availability on an internal host. So that's just an example of how correlation across different types of activities that may come from different data sources can now be emblematic of what's occurring within your environment and also map to a specific control. Alarms also can be configured to require a threshold to be met for an alarm such as 3 attacks from the same host, or alarms can be configured to suppress their frequency, such as only alarming every 30 minutes. And alarms need to be configured to notify specific personnel, groups of personnel, or even designated owners of the infrastructure. In addition, there needs to be an ability to provide an ongoing real-time visibility into these activities as they're occurring through a PCI-oriented dashboard. All right, and next we're going to talk about the security management use case. Security management role really uses the content from the SIEM to provide oversight of the effectiveness of those security roles. Security management is overseeing really the review of summaries of security events and the security operation response activities that were provided by the SIEM. So really looking at through different types of summary reports that may occur on more of a weekly basis rather than a monthly or a quarterly basis. Also, again, specific types of dashboards that are looking at the effectiveness of the response to events as they're occurring within the organization. So SIEM technology has really moved beyond a simple centralized repository of information. And I hope you've seen that through the webinar today, through the presentation today, that really we need to go beyond just central monitoring. Just having the SIEM or the technologies in place really isn't going to be satisfactory to the QSA. That they're looking for an ability to recognize how that technology is being in use and its effectiveness of its being in use within the environment. And so really that next generation of SIEM needs to go beyond central monitoring and needs to go beyond just a collection of reports, that really to offload the work from the QSA, but also from the organization, from being able to interpret that weekly or that monthly, or perhaps just those reports ran before the audit, that if you're trying to interpret that information, translating that into then how do you move back into compliance by recognition of where you might have moved out of compliance since the last time you ran that report, that is a lot of effort for an organization to have to undergo, and could also allow for misses if the translation of these reports really wasn't done as effectively as it could be, or because of just the amount of data within the reports, it allows for error there where something can be missed, but then recognized by the QSA, leading to an audit that can be unsuccessful. So really, where your technology should be providing to you is an automated and ongoing assurance by allowing real-time alarms and looking at correlation of activities and looking at the behavior of activities that are mapped to specific controls. So it's not just that you have the ability to correlate information, but that you have the ability to correlate that information mapped to a specific control, so that you can now recognize when that specific control is now moving out of compliance at the time that you're moving out of compliance. This alleviates the need to really look at these weekly, monthly reports and perform that translation, as the alarms or the activities that are now being recognized will help steer you immediately towards where you are moving out of compliance. It also reduces the spend from the organization, since you're not performing all of that work at once after the fact, where now the scope of that problem may have increased. But as you're now being really alerted to those indicators that you're moving out of compliance at the time it's happening, allows you to really take that action immediately, and as a result, really reduce the scope, which reduces the cost to changing a particular types of operations that will allow you to then move back into compliance. And lastly, the SIEM technology should allow you to really leverage their expertise. That you really, it should put you in a position where those types of alarms, those types of reports, those types of behavioral rules and alarms, they're created on your behalf, mapped to specific controls already for you. That this isn't work that you're performing, but it's work that the vendor, that the SIEM technology that you're using, that you can leverage that immediately so that you can quickly align that technology to the purpose of providing you that ongoing assurance of compliance. And as a result, you can now be able to demonstrate the effectiveness of this technology within your environment and be able to demonstrate your ongoing compliance through not only the ability to show the types of alarms and indicators through the dashboards, but through then, of course, the audit of those weekly and monthly reports, as well as the summary reports that are moved to the appropriate level within management and the executive level. So I hope that this has been an informative webinar for everyone today. I hope that we've been able to teach you something about compliance and the state of compliance in terms of this ongoing kind of evolution within PCI. I'm now going to turn it back to Greg and answer any questions that you may have or that may have arisen during the webinar today. And thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you, Seth and Ken and John. It was a terrific presentation. I want to invite everybody in the audience to send in questions for our panelists. Maybe I could get things rolling. Our readers often ask us about what are the top attack vectors. So maybe you could help us answer that, and how does that compare with the typical company's focus for security?
Okay, this is John Melvin again. So the top attack vectors, through our investigations as well as our own penetration assessments that we do for clients, are basically, the top three are basically weak passwords, social engineering attacks, and remote access methods. So with passwords, what we see is most people meet complexity requirements per security frameworks. Unfortunately, as a good example, that's something that meets complexity would be summer 13. So that's a password that's typical. You can go back last year, it was summer 12, summer 11. These are, you know the behaviors of people, and you use that against them. So social engineering, phone calls, spoofed emails coming from your own domain work. They work time and time again. We call people up. We impersonate IT management. We send emails from legitimate email accounts, legitimate domains. They work. We get people to give us credentials, click on links, get client-side attacks, whatever we need to do against them. Remote access, people supply remote access in their environment all the time. What we see generally is a lack of two-factor authentication for that remote access. A lot of people use double, single-factor authentication. So as a recent example, there was a remote access method that you needed a certificate for, but the certificate was sent to their email address. So the email address is not a true two-factor way to distribute that authentication. With the email address, we had already brute forced the user account for that email. So simply, when we went to the remote access, it required us to have a certificate. We just went to that user's email. Certificate was emailed to them. We grabbed it, used it, and now we're inside. Then we leverage permissions and gain access into the network and all of the data inside. The logs that are shown would show nothing out of the ordinary once we have access, because we're, again, using a valid user credentials with valid remote access methods that are given to us. What we should be seeing, again, show the maturity in the organization, show those logs. What you should be seeing is our attempts to gain that initial access through an MSSP or through a SIEM device. When we're looking at those type of logs, we should be seeing failure, 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 then success. And the clients that we typically do attacks against are not correlating these events and then knowing that some kind of access has happened. That would be the initial attack vectors. Is there another question for us, or turn it back over to you?
Well, thanks, John. Yeah, we got one in from LogRhythm. Seth, we got this question is: has LogRhythm's PCI support been validated by any third party?
A good question, and in fact it has. So we did have an independent QSA evaluate our methodology and approach in terms of not only the reports that we create, but the and the dashboards that we create, but also I talked about kind of those behavior rules, or rules that are looking, or correlation rules that are kind of looking at a specific control and then recognizing whether that control is moving out of compliance. And so we did have validation that, in fact, they like this approach, they preferred this approach in how it is able to register for a specific control that compliance that you're moving out of compliance, and at what point in time that has occurred. No, we did go through a review on that, and that was met successfully.
Okay, thanks, Seth. Here's another one for you. How do the LogRhythm AI engine rules work to provide automated assurance?
Yeah, so what the AI engine rules, those are the rules that make up the correlation, behavioral, kind of statistical rules, looking at really asking questions of in providing, essentially applying analytical techniques to the log data as that log data is coming into the system. So it allows us kind of, if you will, ask questions of the data as it's coming in. And so this really allows us to, really go beyond just checking off the box that we have a central log repository. We can look at, specific types of activities. For example, I can look at, are there denied communications from the cardholder data environment going out to the internet, which is in support of 1.2.1 A through B, and or I can look at just database authentication success and failures from unauthorized accounts in support of 8.5.16. So there's really the spectrum, if you will. We can look for these different types of activities, and when we start to recognize a particular activity or an anomaly to the activity that we're expecting, then we can flag that. That can become either as an alarm or as an event, but that recognizes that there's an indicator that you may be moving out of compliance in the point in time that has occurred, that allows that organization to now take action immediately as a result.
Okay, thanks, Seth. Here's one more question. Can you explain control design versus control effectiveness and some examples of good or required ongoing testing methods for those?
Sure. This is John again. So control design, basically what we mean by that is you base your controls on industry standards for a security framework, and then you assess those controls. So as a QSA, people have that security framework in place for the most part, and we do an assessment against them, and we validate as best as we can with QSAs. With the PFI, on the other hand, the PFI is going to demand that those controls are in place. Show me that you're logging. Show me that you can correlate. Show me that it goes back the effective amount of retention time. Show me that this device is in place and can catch these things. Because if you can't, you're already not compliant. I have to report that to the payment card, game over. Okay? So the control design is based on a security framework, and then have a good person, people, company, whatever, come in and assess and audit against that control framework. That's step one. Step two, bring in that effectiveness. Test those controls in place. So we have a good baseline. You have a security framework in place. We've audited against it. Great. Now test against that. So bring back in that first question you asked me. So with passwords, with social engineering, with remote access, do the following. Do password audits across your organization. Literally test those passwords and see if you can get in. Do social engineering tests. Test the phone, test the email capability, see if people can bite. Do incident response tests coupled with penetration tests so that you have an actual attacker attacking your network, and then the devices in place to see if they can detect it and correlate it. Know your accounts. So stop, trying to just rely on alarms and the bells and whistles at the network layer and antivirus, and really audit your accounts and baseline the normal traffic and know what's out of place. And then the last thing I would always say is compliance is not security. So again, we've said it so many times, test that effectiveness, test your devices, and really get a handle on what you think is in place versus what is effectively in place. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, John. And with that, we're going to have to wrap it up for this session. So let me thank LogRhythm's Seth Goldhammer and Secure State's Ken Stasiak and John Melvin for sharing their insight and expertise today. And, of course, thanks to all of you for tuning in. We can now escort you over to our virtual expo hall where you can visit the LogRhythm booth. Reps are on hand to answer any further questions you might have. We have one more session following in our PCI e-conference, so we hope you might join us for that one as well. This webcast and all of the sessions in our PCI e-conference will be available on demand beginning tomorrow on the SC Magazine website under the Events tab. Thank you, gentlemen. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in.